Okay, we're going to be talking about how to write cadences using the 1 and the 5 chord. So there's a few different types of cadences you can create using the 1 and the 5 chord. So you can create a perfect authentic cadence that uses 5 to 1 in the bass. You can do an imperfect authentic cadence, which is also 5 to 1, or possibly an inversion if you're using a contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadence. And you can have a half cadence. So a half cadence, strictly speaking, is anything that resolves to 5, but for now we're going to limit it to 1 moving to the 5 chord. So we're going to go over each one of these. So the first thing you need to know, remember when we were talking about the different scale degrees. You've got, in a C major scale, you've got 7 scale degrees. Each one of these scale degrees has a unique name. So the 5th scale degree we call the dominant. The 1st scale degree we call the tonic. And those are the only 2 scale degrees we have to worry about right now. So you can build triads on the 5th and the 1st scale degree, or really any of these scale degrees. And the way you do that is you simply write in thirds the scale degrees that you are working with. Let's go ahead and, okay. So on the 1st and the 5th scale degree, the tonic and the dominant, you have something called tendency tones on one of these chords. And this was in the lecture, so hopefully you watched the previous lecture so you already have an idea of what a tendency tone is. So when we're dealing with triads, the only tendency tone you have is the 3rd of the 5 chord, the dominant chord. That 3rd is a leading tone. And the leading tone, it always has to resolve up by step. There are some exceptions, but you don't need to worry about that just yet. So if I see a B in a dominant chord, it needs to resolve to the C right here. So B will always resolve to C. That's your leading tone, it resolves to C. That's the only tendency tone you have right now. There's other tendency tones which we'll get to when we get to 7th chords, but for now, just know that the leading tone must resolve up by step. So now that we know how to build a tonic and a dominant triad, and you can do this in any key, if you're in the key of D major, you just write out a D major scale, put in the key signature. Your tonic is going to be D, F sharp, and A. And your dominant is going to be the 5th scale degree, so that's A, C sharp, which you don't actually have to write in because it's already in the key signature, and E. So you can do this with any scale degree. So let's say you have a 5-1 progression that you want to write. Let's do this one in the key of C, just to make it nice and easy. The first thing I want you to do is you need to have a grand staff. Notice I'm leaving a space here, which I'll get to in a minute. So in order to write a grand staff, you need a treble clef and a bass clef. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write a big C underneath it with a colon. That indicates the key. So when you're doing an analysis, you write this big C to indicate that you are in the key of C. And you can double check that. You'll know you're not in C minor because you look at the key signature. If you're in C minor, you'd have 3 flats. Since you don't have 3 flats, there's no sharps, no flats, you know you're in the key of C. So then we're going to write a Roman numeral 5 moving to 1. So this indicates that we are going to write a 5-1 progression. So at this point, we know that we're either writing a perfect authentic cadence or an imperfect authentic cadence. There's also the contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadence, and that occurs when you have an inversion, but it's still a 5 moving to 1. The bass will just move by step. And we're not actually going to focus on the contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadence right now. We're just going to deal with our perfect authentic and imperfect authentic, the strong imperfect authentic cadence. So in order to do this, I need to write floor part harmony. So we need to have the soprano, alto, in the treble, and then in the bass, we need to have the tenor and the bass. So that's going to be 4 parts. So since triads only have 3 chord members, that means we're going to have to double one of the chord members. In a root position progression like this, we're just going to want to double the root of the chord. So one way you can do this if you're having a little bit of trouble with chords still is you can write a third staff. So I'm going to do this one on the treble clef. I'm going to write out my 5 chord. It's right here. I'm going to write G, B, and D. And then I'm also going to write my C major chord, my tonic. So C, E, and G. And this will allow me to make sure that I put in all the chord members. Now, since I also told you that you want to double the root of these chords, I'm going to put a second G and a second C right here. And you'll see why I'm doing this in a minute. So the first thing I'm going to do, whenever I approach a chord progression, I look at the Roman numerals and I just put in the bass line because that's really easy. So I've got a G here and I've got a C here. So I go ahead and I go over to this little diagram up here. I cross out one of my G's and I cross out one of my C's. Now I know I've used those chord members. So the next thing I want to do is I want to deal with my tendency tones, which in this case is just a leading tone, because that way I won't make a mistake. The leading tone always has to go up, and the leading tone is going to be the third of your 5 chord. So I'm going to put my B right here in the tenor. And I'm going to immediately resolve it to C, and I want you to always draw a line and write LT to indicate that that's a leading tone. So I got my B, and I'm going to cross out my C. So now I've got both my C's for the 1 chord. So I'm good on the root of both the 5 and the 1 chord. The 1 chord's doubled. I still need to double the root of the 5 chord. So I'm going to go ahead and just take care of that right now by putting the G here in the soprano. So since I put that G in the soprano, what you're going to find is that it's not going to be a perfect authentic cadence because the 1 chord's not going to have scale degree 1 in the soprano. So for a perfect authentic cadence, you have to have 5-1 in the bass, which is shown right here, and same with imperfect authentic. But you also have to have scale degree 7 moving to scale degree 1 for it to be a perfect authentic cadence. An imperfect authentic cadence will basically either have the 3rd or the 5th of the chord in the soprano. So we'll get to the imperfect authentic cadence in a minute. But this is what makes a perfect authentic cadence. You got 5-1 in the bass and 7-1 in the soprano. What the inner voices do doesn't really matter as long as you have complete chords. So I cross off my G. Now I have 1 chord member left, the D. So I'm going to put my D right here in the alto. So I've got my soprano with my stems going up, my alto with my stems going down, my tenor with my stems going up, and my bass with my stems going down. So now what I've done is I've got a doubled C, I've got a complete 5 chord, I've got a doubled C on my 1 chord, and I need to put in my E and my G. So what you want to do is maintain the common tone whenever you can. So here, the common tone is going to be the G, because the 5 chord also has a G. So I'm just going to label that as common tone. So now I cross off my G, the only note left is an E, and I just put that right there so it moves by step in the alto. So one thing you need to do after you finish your chord progression is check to make sure everything moves by step. The only thing that should be leaping is the bass. You also need to make sure you have an octave between the soprano and alto and the tenor. So between the soprano and the alto, you should have an octave or less. Between the alto and the tenor, an octave or less. And then between the tenor and the bass, you can have up to a 12th. So we're talking about intervals here. In this case, I kept everything easily within an octave, and in fact, the tenor and the soprano are also within an octave. So this is a real close position here. So that's how you do it in major. If you want to do it in minor, you've got something you have to watch out for. So let's just do this in minor. I'm going to go ahead and put in my key signature. So C minor is going to be 3 flats. So I've got a B, E flat, and an A flat. Then here I've got a B, E flat, and an A flat. So I'm going to go over here to my scale. I'm going to write in my flats. So what ends up happening is in a minor scale, the dominant is minor. So we call that a minor dominant. And we need to avoid having a minor dominant at a cadence. So the way we fix that is we just raise the third of the 5 chord and make it natural. And that's very important. If you don't have that raised natural, what you have, or it could be a sharp depending on the key, but if you don't have that raised leading tone, it's not a leading tone, it's a subtonic. So if we have C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat. This here, if you remember your scale degrees, this is a subtonic. The only way you make it a leading tone is by raising it a half step to become natural. So I'm just going to get rid of this, and I'm going to write in a natural sign to make sure I know that that is natural. So basically you're going to do the same thing. You're going to have your bass line. You're going to write in 5-1. You're going to write a lowercase c, should be about half the size of Roman numeral, and the 5 moves to a minor 1. So you put in your bass line, so you got G and C, and then you need to have your leading tone. So since there's a B flat in the key signature, I have to raise this. Leading tone just goes up by step to the tonic, and then I'm going to have my D going to an E. It's the same exact thing. There's nothing special about writing it in minor other than you have to make sure you raise that leading tone. If you don't raise the leading tone, you have done something wrong, and it's a very common mistake with students. So if we look at this, we have 5-1 motion in the bass. So that corresponds to both the perfect authentic cadence and the imperfect authentic cadence. But then look at the last note of the soprano on the 1 chord. That's a G. So that is actually the 5th of the 1 chord. So because of that, it cannot be a perfect authentic cadence. So this has to be an imperfect authentic cadence. So in imperfect authentic cadence, you end with the 3rd or the 5th scale degree in the soprano. Could be either one. All right, so let's do a few more of these. Let's go ahead and do a perfect authentic cadence, and let's do it in the key of E major. So I'm going to go ahead and write my treble clef with my chords, just so I make sure I get all my chord members. I'm going to have a 5 and a 1. So in the key of E, I've got F, C, G, D. And I need the notes B, D sharp, and F sharp. That's my 5 chord in the key of E. And then I also need an E, a G sharp, and a B. So that's my 1 chord. So now that I have my chords listed, I'm going to double these roots. So I make sure I use all 4 chord members, or have 4 parts for the composition. I'm going to put in my key signature here. And then I'm going to write 5 to 1 because I know I want to have a 5-1 progression. And I'm going to make this one a perfect authentic cadence. So that means I have to have scale degree 1 in the soprano on the 1 chord. And I have to have root motion in the bass, moving from 5 to 1. So let's go ahead and fill in our bass line first. So I've got a B and an E. So I'm going to cross off my B and one of my E's from my little scratch pad up here. And then I'm going to go ahead and double that B because I know I need to double the B in the 5 chord. So there, my B is doubled. So then also I see that my B is a common tone between the 5 and the 1 chord. So I'm going to take care of that right away, and I'm going to hold my common tone over. And again, I want you to always write a line and indicate the common tone and the leading tone. So now I'm going to go to my leading tone of the 5 chord. That's a third of the chord. So in order to make this a perfect authentic cadence, I know I need motion from 7 to 1 in the soprano. So I'm going to have a D sharp here, and I'm going to move it up to my tonic. So I took care of my D sharp and my other E. So I'm in good shape right now. I'm going to mark that this is a leading tone. And then I just have an F sharp and a G. So I just put in my F sharp here, and it comes up to G. So there's a few things you should know. First, you've got 4 chord members in each chord. Second, only the bass jumps, or leaps in this case. Third, there's a common tone. So we've got our common tone. Number 4, you got a leading tone. And finally, the last voice moves by step. It doesn't skip, it doesn't jump. If you do something, if you write your chord progression and you end up having something like this, where the F jumps up to an E, that's the 7th, you know you did something wrong. You absolutely have to move by step. That is imperative here. So that's a perfect authentic cadence. So let's go ahead and do another one. Let's do an imperfect authentic cadence. Let's do this one on F. And again, real quick, let's just do this in minor before we go on to F. So here's E minor. So in order to make this minor, I need just 1 sharp. Everything else stays the same. I still have a 5 chord. I need to make this a romanette. The B still comes up to E. I'm still going to double and keep my common tone. This F sharp will still come up to G, but the leading tone is now D natural instead of D sharp. So I need to make that sharp.